Life only comes around once, right? You're supposed to live it in a way that leaves no room for regrets. At least, that's what I'd always believed. For a while, I thought I'd done just that. Followed the so-called right path, acted responsibly. But as I sat there nursing my drink, those thoughts felt more like a joke than anything else. My mind was stuck on the past few weeks, replaying every little detail, trying to piece together any evidence of Melanie's betrayal. My stomach was in knots, twisting tighter with every memory I unearthed. No matter how much I tried to push it aside, something felt seriously off. The problem was, I couldn't put my finger on exactly what it was. It gnawed at me constantly. I was almost certain something was happening behind my back. But I didn't have any hard proof. No texts, no calls, no blatant lies. Just this nagging feeling that wouldn't let go. Was she sneaking around? Or was I just imagining things? The more I tried to dismiss it, the more persistent that feeling became. Whether it was a full-blown affair or some casual fling, my gut told me something was going on. And the more I thought about it, the more undeniable it all seemed. For what felt like forever, I'd been stewing in these suspicions, asking myself how long it had been happening. Weeks? Months? Longer? I tipped my glass of Jack Daniels and took another slow sip, giving the bartender a nod. He responded with a faint, knowing smile, like he'd seen men in my exact state more times than he cared to count. The bar was quiet, the kind of quiet that matched the gray drizzle outside. Low murmurs filled the air, blending into the dull hum of rain tapping against the windows. Everyone inside looked like they were just biding their time, waiting for the storm to let up so they could go home. One woman stood out, though. She was dressed way too fancy for a place like this, throwing sidelong glances at anyone who'd pay attention. An older guy had her in his sights, buying her drinks and leaning in like he actually had a chance. Poor guy didn't realize she was already interested. She wasn't fooling anyone. Meanwhile, the rest of the crowd sat around, lifeless, passing time like they were as trapped as I felt. I stayed put, sipping my whiskey and running the same thoughts in circles, unsure what my next move should be. That's when a voice from behind startled me. I turned around to see Wendy standing there, her sharp gaze locked on me like she could see straight into my soul. For a second, I couldn't even find the words to speak. She shrugged off her rain-soaked coat, her hair sticking to her face in damp strands, and I wondered what had brought her here of all places. When I asked, she just said she'd been worried about me, claimed she had a feeling I'd be here. Her tone was calm, but her eyes told a different story. She wanted to talk, I could tell, but I just stared at her, trying to gauge her motives, wondering if I could actually trust her. Eventually, I steadied myself with another sip of whiskey and motioned to the bartender for a vodka. If she wanted to talk, we'd talk, but I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever truths might come out. We waited for the bartender to move on before picking up our conversation. For a moment, our eyes locked, the tension between us almost tangible. It felt like we were circling something unspoken, both of us testing the waters, neither ready to dive in. Then Wendy broke the silence. She said I seemed burdened, like I was carrying something way too heavy for one person. Her words hit a little too close to home, but I held her gaze anyway, at least for a moment. Then, like a coward, I looked away, mumbling some excuse about being fine and brushing her off. She didn't buy it. Not for a second. That's when it hit me. No matter how much I tried to deny it, Wendy could see right through me. She always could. She set her glass down, leaned forward with her hands clasped, and hit me with words that felt like a punch to the gut. She knew something was going on. I tried to play dumb, pretending I had no idea what she was talking about. But Wendy wasn't letting it slide. She suggested we grab a booth for some privacy. I wasn't thrilled about the idea. God knows I didn't want to dig up what was buried, but I went along. Once we were seated, I tried to steer the conversation somewhere else, asking her what exactly she thought she knew. It was a desperate move, a last-ditch attempt to avoid the topic altogether. Wendy wasn't having it. She reminded me that, after everything we'd been through, I couldn't lie to her. And she was right. Couldn't. Not to Wendy. We'd known each other for years, since she was 17, back when I first started dating Melanie. She'd always been around, even had a little crush on me once, though I ended up marrying her sister instead. Over time, Wendy grew into a confident, beautiful woman. By her mid-20s, she'd become someone any man would be lucky to have in their life. But sitting across from her now, all I could think about was how my marriage, approaching 5 years, was hanging by a thread. Wendy didn't need to say a word. The concern in her eyes told me she already knew how much I was struggling to hold it together. And then, just like that, she said it. She looked me dead in the eye, no hesitation, and told me she believed Melanie was cheating on me. My mind went blank, completely blank. Her words rattled around in my head, but I couldn't make sense of them. I didn't want to hear it, and I sure as hell didn't want to believe it. Some part of me thought if I ignored it, just refused to acknowledge it, it might not be real. Maybe, if I kept pretending everything was fine, I could avoid the pain that came with the truth. Wendy must have noticed the way I froze because she asked if I was in shock or just buried in denial. She said she cared about me, that she was worried I wasn't seeing things clearly. And then, almost hesitantly, she added that part of her still hoped she was wrong. Wendy kept talking, her tone laced with frustration, but I kept brushing her off, clinging stubbornly to my denial. Deep down, I knew she wasn't wrong, but admitting it, that felt impossible. Finally, her patience snapped. Her eyes flashed with anger so fierce that even the bartender glanced over, concern etched on his face. I quickly waved him off, muttering something about everything being fine. Wendy, still fuming, shot him an apology for the outburst. I could see how frustrated she was, but it wasn't just anger. It came from a place of care, genuine, unwavering care. Wendy had always seen herself as my friend, someone who would stand by me no matter what. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was practically begging me to open my eyes and face the truth. "It's time to take action," she said firmly. I didn't want to hear it, but I couldn't ignore the raw emotion in her voice. Reluctantly, I agreed to listen. She started with something that happened a few weeks back. Wendy had been hanging out with Melanie when a call came in. Melanie, without a word, got up and left the room to answer it. Wendy found that odd. They were sisters, after all, close ones at that. Why the secrecy? Why not just answer the call right there? As Wendy recounted the incident, that all too familiar knot of dread tightened in my stomach. She went on to admit that she'd checked Melanie's phone later. It wasn't even locked. The call had been from someone saved as Camden, a name that meant absolutely nothing to Wendy. Curious, she decided to keep an eye out for anything else that felt off. A week later, the pieces started falling into place. Wendy figured out who this Camden guy was. An old friend of Melanie's. Someone from before I was in the picture. They'd apparently reconnected recently, maybe through social media or some messaging app. Whatever it was, they'd been talking for weeks. I sat there in silence, trying to process what she was saying. "I haven't noticed anything like that," I muttered, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't entirely true. Sure, I hadn't seen this, but I couldn't deny there'd been a growing distance between Melanie and me. Wendy nodded, like she'd expected me to say that. She went on, explaining that Melanie and Camden weren't doing anything blatantly obvious, just small things. But those small things, when added up, felt deliberate, suspicious. I tried to reason it out, clinging to the possibility of innocence. "Maybe it's nothing," I said. "Could just be two old friends catching up." But Wendy wasn't having it. "It's not nothing," she shot back, her bluntness slicing through my denial like a knife. Her words hit me hard. So hard I had to ask, is there something big I'm missing? Something I've been too blind to see? I mentioned how everything lately felt like it was working against us. The stress, the distance, the way life seemed to leave no time for anything real between Melanie and me. Wendy looked at me with a mix of disbelief and pity. "You've got to stop burying your head in the sand," she said, her voice softening just a bit. "I'm telling you this because I care about you. You matter, and you deserve to know the truth." Her concern stung as much as it comforted. I pressed her for more details, desperate to understand how bad things really were. Her face gave away more than her words did, and it fueled a slow, simmering anger inside me. I finally snapped. If there's more, just say it. Where? When? How? How has she been meeting him? Wendy flinched at the edge in my voice, but her expression stayed steady. She was preparing to tell me more, and I wasn't sure I was ready to hear it. Wendy dropped the bombshell without flinching. Melanie had met up with this Camden guy at least 3 times in the last 2 weeks. She hadn't been sure at first, but 2 days ago, over lunch with a friend who worked with Melanie, she'd learned something new. Her friend had mentioned, almost casually, that Melanie had gone out with Camden twice for lunch and once for dinner just last week. Wendy's tone was measured, but I could tell she was testing the waters, gauging my reaction. "Do those times line up with anything you've noticed?" she asked carefully. I leaned back, my mind racing. As I thought about it, a few things started to click into place. I remembered calling Melanie's office on 2 of those days to ask her out for lunch. Both times, her assistant told me she'd already left or wasn't available. Was that when she was with him? Then there was that work seminar last week. She'd claimed it ran late, and afterward, her team had stayed at the hotel bar for drinks. I'd been skeptical even then, especially when she got home well past midnight. That night was still burned into my memory. The way she avoided eye contact, went straight to the shower, and climbed into bed without a word. No warmth, no connection, just cold, distant silence. The pieces were coming together, and the picture wasn't pretty. Wendy must have noticed the way my hands tightened into fists. "Don't act on impulse," she urged, her voice steady but firm. "You don't want to do something you'll regret? Or worse, something that'll land you in trouble." Her words barely registered. I was too far gone. My mind had already made the leap. I wasn't going to tolerate being cheated on, not by Melanie and not with some guy who thought he could waltz into my life and wreck it. Wendy's eyes flickered with worry when she saw the resolve in my face. "Listen," she said, leaning closer, "I get it, but you need to think this through. You need a plan." Her calm voice, oddly enough, did help cool the fire burning in my chest. But it didn't weaken my conviction. If anything, it only solidified the gut feeling I'd been trying to ignore. My suspicions weren't just paranoia. They were real. I looked Wendy dead in the eye. "Do you know where Melanie is right now?" Without missing a beat, Wendy answered, "She's probably with him." That answer hit me like a freight train. My blood boiled, and before I knew it, my fist slammed against the table, rattling our glasses and drawing stares from the other patrons. The bartender glanced over, his face a mix of concern and wariness. I waved him off without a word and turned back to Wendy, my voice low and sharp. "Do you know where they are right now?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know their exact location, but I'll talk to Melanie tomorrow. I'll get you more information," she promised. "This guy's married, with kids, but I don't know where he lives. Yet, I'll figure it out." Something in her voice, the certainty of her determination, eased my anger just a fraction. I reached across the table, gripping her hand tightly. "Thank you," I said, my voice softening as I noticed a tear slip down her cheek. Without thinking, I wiped it away, a strange mix of gratitude and awkwardness settling between us. Wendy gave me a look, her expression full of concern and something else I couldn't quite place. "What do you plan to do next?" she asked quietly. I reassured Wendy that I wouldn't act impulsively, at least not right away. But deep down, I was resolute. This had to end one way or another. I told her flat out. There was no way I'd forgive either of them. They were going to pay for betraying me. In the meantime, I'd protect what was mine and start gathering my own evidence. With a final swig, I drained the last of my Jack, waved to the bartender, and left a tip on the counter. Wendy still looked uneasy, and she hesitated before asking, "When do you plan to confront her?" I thought it over briefly. "Tomorrow. First, I'm going to make some calls and secure my assets. Melanie's not walking away with a single penny of mine." Wendy nodded, her expression softening. "It must be hard. Living with her, knowing what you know." I let out a bitter laugh. "Hard doesn't even begin to cover it. The last few weeks have been hell. If she hasn't noticed how distant I've been, she's more blind than I thought." Wendy stood to leave, slipping on her coat. Let's meet again tomorrow, she said. I'll see what else I can dig up in the meantime. As she pulled the coat over her shoulders, I stepped closer to help adjust it. For a moment, as I stood near her, I couldn't help but notice how much she looked like Melanie. Same soft features, same sad eyes brimming with unshed tears. She glanced up at me, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Take care of yourself, okay?" I leaned down and kissed her gently on the cheek. "I'll be fine," I said quietly. She gave me a small, sad smile before turning and disappearing into the rainy night. I sat back down, taking a deep breath as I started plotting my next moves. One thing was clear. They weren't getting away with this. My revenge would be swift, cold, and merciless. After that, the night turned into a blur. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my own bed, my head pounding like a jackhammer and my mouth dry as sandpaper. Rolling over, I saw that Melanie was already up. I could hear faint noises coming from downstairs, probably her making breakfast or tidying up. Swinging my legs over the edge of the bed, I forced myself to stand, stumbling into the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. As I staggered into the kitchen, Melanie was there, her back to me. When she turned, her eyes scanned me up and down. "Rough night?" she asked casually. I muttered something vague about meeting up with an old friend and having one too many. Walking over to the fridge, I poured myself a glass of orange juice, drained it in one gulp, and immediately poured another. Melanie wasn't done. "Who's this old friend?" she pressed, her tone light but probing. I froze for a split second, realizing I needed to come up with a story. Without thinking too much, I mentioned a guy named Camden, an old college buddy who happened to be in town for business. At the mention of Camden, I saw something flash across her face. Recognition, guilt, maybe panic. It was quick, but unmistakable. She turned away almost immediately, busying herself with something on the counter. I kept going, talking about my supposed college days with Camden, how we used to play football together. Melanie acted like she didn't remember him, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the stiffness in her movements. She was hiding something, and now I was more certain than ever. Melanie brushed off my mention of Camden with a shrug, saying it didn't matter as long as I'd had a good time. That was the first red flag. Sitting across from me, she seemed oddly detached, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. Casually, I brought up her evening, trying to sound disinterested while keeping my eyes on her reaction. She told me she'd wrapped up work, grabbed a quick bite and a drink with coworkers, and made it home around 9:30. But that was a lie. I'd been home until 10 before heading to the bar, and I hadn't seen her once. That was the second glaring red flag. She kept talking, rambling about her plans for the day, then casually mentioned she might be late again tonight. Almost like an afterthought, she added that her old friend Camden was supposed to reach out to her. The mention of his name was like a slap to the face. I forced a smile and suggested she invite him over sometime so we could all catch up. For a split second, she hesitated. Then she nodded, saying, "Sure, maybe." Her tone was casual, but there was something strained underneath, like she wasn't sure if I meant it. "Do you actually remember Camden?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. Her voice was steady, but there was tension there, something she was trying to hide. "Oh yeah," I replied, keeping my tone light. "I'm fine. I can handle things on my own." But my mind was already spinning, racing ahead to my next moves. After finishing my juice, I popped a couple of painkillers for my headache and told her I needed to get ready for the day. As I stepped outside, one thing became blindingly clear. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Melanie and her lover had no idea what was coming for them. As I buttoned up my shirt, my resolve hardened. I was done playing along with this charade. The idea of her sneaking off to see Camden behind my back ignited a fire in me, and with every passing second, my need for revenge burned hotter. The anger I felt toward him, a man I barely even knew, grew with each new thought. The workday was a whirlwind. Back-to-back calls, endless meetings, and a flood of issues that seemed to pile up faster than I could handle. My secretary managed to filter out a few unnecessary calls, but there was no escaping the ones that really mattered. Despite the chaos, The tension inside me only grew stronger, fueled by an overwhelming need to settle the score. By mid-morning, things finally slowed down enough for me to take care of what I really needed to handle. Closing my office door, I sat at my desk and focused on my finances. Within 15 minutes, I'd moved funds, locked down our joint account, and secured every dollar that was under my control. I even scheduled a meeting with a divorce lawyer. I figured I'd gather a bit more proof before making any big moves, but honestly, it hardly mattered at this point. Melanie had her own accounts, but I wasn't worried about those. My priority had been the joint account, and now it was safely out of her reach. With no kids to complicate things, a clean split was all I wanted, if it came to that. The only way I could see moving forward was if Melanie confessed everything and begged for forgiveness. But even then, I hesitated, and in that moment, I knew it was already over. That heavy realization hit me like a brick to the chest, pressing down with a weight I couldn't shake. Sure, it saddened me, but I'd come too far down this path to turn back now. Sitting there in my office, I found myself reflecting on everything. The lies, the signs, the steps I'd already taken. Part of me wanted more details, more proof of Camden and Melanie's betrayal. But another part of me wondered if I even needed more. Maybe knowing the truth was enough to destroy them both. Just then, my phone buzzed, jolting me back to reality. It was Wendy. When I answered, I told her I'd been busy securing my finances. She jumped straight into an update. She dug up more dirt on Camden Clifford. Turns out he was married, too. Wendy had managed to track down his home address and workplace, thanks to a friend who'd spotted him out with Melanie. According to Wendy, things were getting serious between them, even though they were trying to keep it quiet. Finally, I felt like I had something concrete to work with. Send me everything you've got, I told her. A few minutes later, I had Camden's social media profile pulled up on my computer. Staring at his picture, I felt a vague sense of recognition tugging at the back of my mind. Had I seen him before? Maybe met him once? The memory was too faint to grasp, so I shoved it aside. Deciding to change tactics, I called Melanie around lunchtime. As we chatted, she casually mentioned she had a meeting with a client named Mr. Clifford. Hearing his name come out of her mouth was like a slap to the face. There was a hint of something in her tone, so casual it felt almost mocking. Strike 3. In that moment, I made up my mind. Swift, merciless action was the only way forward. After we hung up, I sat at my desk, gripping the edge so hard my knuckles turned white. My jaw clenched as I forced myself to respond when she'd said, "I love you." The words felt hollow, bitter. Just then, my secretary poked her head in, offering to grab me lunch from the deli down the street. Without looking up, I told her to get me something heavy, red meat, something I could tear into. She hesitated, raising an eyebrow like she could sense something was off, but she didn't press. Instead, she quietly shut the door, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The tension in the room must have been palpable. While I waited for lunch, Wendy was busy running down leads of her own. She'd gone straight to Melanie's office, determined to see things for herself, and she didn't have to wait long. She saw Melanie stepping out of the elevator with a tall, dark-haired man, Camden Clifford himself. Without missing a beat, Wendy walked right up to them. She didn't hesitate, didn't hold back. "So," she said casually, looking directly at Camden, "how long have you known Melanie?" The question clearly caught him off guard. He stumbled over his words, looking at Melanie for help. But Melanie was quick to pull him aside, muttering something about being late for a meeting. They rushed toward the exit, slipping into a waiting cab. But not before Melanie cast a nervous glance back at Wendy, her expression tight with guilt. Meanwhile, back in my office, I sat at my desk, chewing slowly on the massive sub my secretary had brought me. Each bite felt deliberate, almost methodical. I wasn't just eating, I was thinking, plotting. Savory as the sandwich was, it couldn't distract me from the growing storm inside me. I savored every bite of the red meat, chewing slowly as I considered my next move. The phone buzzed, and Wendy's name lit up the screen. She confirmed that Melanie had left her office and, after a quick check with her secretary, it was clear she wouldn't be back for the rest of the afternoon. With my finances locked down, the locks on the house ready to be changed at a moment's notice, and my lawyer standing by for the final go-ahead, everything was in place. Tonight would mark the start of my plan. But I wasn't about to show my hand just yet. I wanted them to feel secure, let them think they were in the clear, right before the rug got pulled out from under them. My dad used to say, never let them see you coming. Go straight for the kill. It was time to remember those words. Time to make things right. That evening, Melanie walked in like it was any other night, acting completely normal, as if nothing had changed. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and started chatting about her day. But when I leaned in to kiss her, I caught it. A faint trace of cologne clinging to her clothes. A man's cologne. The scent stopped me cold. She noticed my hesitation but didn't say anything. I gave her a light peck on the cheek and turned toward the door. Everything okay? She called after me, her voice tinged with curiosity. Where are you going? Poker night with some work buddies, I replied, forcing an even tone that seemed to satisfy her. She nodded, gave me a casual wave, and turned her attention to something else. Once I was outside, I climbed into my car and gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white as I clenched my jaw. Backing out of the driveway, I let out a slow, controlled breath. My mind raced with everything that was about to happen. I drove straight to Samuel's place. Samuel was an old friend. The kind of guy you didn't have to explain anything to, loyal to a fault. He'd been through his own troubles, had some combat training, and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. When I called him earlier, he didn't ask a single question. He just said, tell me when and where, exactly what I needed. When I arrived, there was no time wasted on small talk. We went straight to his garage. I changed into dark overalls and pulled on a ski mask. Together, we looked like shadows, silent, focused. Samuel had an old, beat-up car he'd bought for cash a while back, the kind of vehicle no one would notice. We climbed in, the engine rumbling quietly, and drove across town, heading for the address Wendy had sent me. We didn't need to talk. Every detail of the plan had already been laid out. When we got to Camden Clifford's house, Samuel parked across the street, the car blending perfectly into the shadows. The house was mostly dark, except for a single light glowing from one of the windows. We sat in silence, mentally preparing for what was coming. My pulse was steady, my anger simmering just below the surface. After a few minutes, the front door opened. Camden stepped out, locking up behind him, and got into his car. He didn't seem to notice us as he backed out of the driveway and started down the street. We followed, keeping a safe distance. There was no need to rush. We knew exactly where he was going. The driving range. When he pulled into the lot, we parked in the shadows, watching as the evening crowd thinned out. Cars trickled away one by one, leaving only a handful behind. I sat there, gripping the armrest, my anger a low, steady burn. The time was coming, and I was ready. The anger simmered just beneath the surface, making it damn near impossible to sit still. Every fiber of me wanted to storm over there and confront Camden right then and there, but I knew it wasn't the right time. Timing was everything, so we waited. When Camden finally made his way back to his car, Samuel slipped out of our vehicle with that practiced, quiet ease of his. He moved like a shadow, ready for whatever came next. I stayed in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel tightly, my pulse pounding as I watched Samuel finish up what we'd planned. A few tense minutes later, he was back in the car, peeling off his gloves and mask as he slid into the passenger seat. Well, he said, his voice calm and even. That went smoother than I expected. I glanced over, feeling a wave of genuine gratitude. Thanks, man. I couldn't have done this without you. Samuel just shrugged it off, his tone casual. Still owe you for things in the past. Couldn't pay you back even if I tried. I shook my head, reminding him, that's not how real friendship works. No debts, no tallies, just having each other's backs. He smirked but didn't argue. At least, I added, your hands are clean. No cameras in the lot, no witnesses. We've got nothing to worry about. A grim satisfaction settled over me as I drove us out of the lot, keeping everything low-key and controlled. The night had gone exactly as planned. As we headed back, Samuel suggested we join the others for poker. "They're probably at my place by now," he said, gesturing at the time on the dashboard. I agreed, and we spent the next 4 hours at the card table. The atmosphere was light, full of laughter and camaraderie, but the guys could tell something was weighing on me. They didn't press, though, just offered quiet support with their presence, which only strengthened my resolve for what was coming next. But before I confronted Melanie, I had a few mind games in store to keep her guessing, to keep her on edge. I stumbled through the front door just after 1 a.m., putting on a sloppy, exaggerated drunk act. Samuel had one of the guys drop me off, leaving my car at his place. Perfect for the story I was about to spin. Melanie was still awake, sitting on the couch, and the moment I walked in, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why are you so late?" she asked, her voice clipped and sharp. I waved her off with a slurred response, doing my best impression of a man who'd had one too many. "Samuel and the guys had to drive me home. Too much Jack Daniels tonight, you know." I fumbled with my jacket, making a show of trying to hang it on the peg and missing entirely, then collapsed onto the sofa with a loud sigh. Melanie sat across from me, arms crossed, her expression dripping with disgust. She didn't even try to hide it. I kept my face blank, saying nothing, waiting her out. It didn't take long. She broke the silence, blurting out, "What's going on with you? Theodore? Is there someone else? You've been acting so strange lately." The surge of anger that hit me was almost too much to control, but I forced it down, replacing it with a lazy chuckle. I leaned back, keeping my cool. "I'm fine," I said, my voice steady despite the alcohol act. "Just going through a rough patch. But don't worry. It'll all be over soon." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and I could see them unsettle her. Her expression shifted, a flicker of uncertainty passing through her eyes. She could sense something was off but couldn't quite put her finger on it. Eventually, she got up, muttering something about being tired, and headed upstairs. I followed her after a few minutes, the faint scent of cologne still lingering in my nose, my mind racing with what was to come. In bed, I pretended to fall asleep right away, my breathing slow and steady. I could feel Melanie watching me, frustrated. It was as if she wanted to pick a fight, to force a confrontation, but I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction. Not yet. The next morning, she was up first, brewing coffee in the kitchen. I dragged myself downstairs, still playing up the hungover act. Every step was exaggerated, every groan deliberate. "Morning," I mumbled, rubbing my temples. "My head's killing me." Without much enthusiasm, she tossed me some painkillers. I caught them midair, downed them with a sip of water, and shuffled over to the coffee pot. As I sipped my mug, my eyes landed on her phone sitting on the kitchen table. She stiffened. The shift was subtle, but I caught it. Her unease was practically radiating off her. She didn't grab the phone outright, that would have been too obvious, but I could tell she was hyper-aware of it. Playing it casual, I poured myself a glass of orange juice. Then, acting like it was no big deal, I picked up her phone as if I were just moving it out of the way. A flash of panic crossed her face. Glancing at the screen, I saw an incoming message. I didn't linger too long. I didn't want to tip her off, but the moment was enough to rattle her. Handing it back, I commented, "Your battery looks low. You wouldn't want to miss any important messages." Before she could respond, I strolled out of the kitchen and headed upstairs to get dressed. I could feel her eyes on my back, probably trying to figure out if I knew something. Deep down, she was likely convincing herself I was still in the dark. She probably thought her little affair was harmless. Just some fun lunches, a few dinners, and a handful of hotel meetups. In her mind, it was innocent. She probably believed I hadn't noticed anything wrong at home. When I rushed back downstairs, Melanie tried for a more affectionate goodbye, but I sidestepped her attempt. I slipped out the door with a quick wave and a forced smile. Once I was at work, I wasted no time pushing my plan further into motion. Around 11 a.m., I sent Melanie a text. I kept it casual, apologizing for being distant and telling her I'd had a lot on my mind. "Don't worry," I added, Everything will be sorted out soon. Leaning back in my chair, I smirked. I couldn't wait to see how she'd react. Later that day, Wendy showed up at my office, her face etched with concern. She didn't waste any time. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "Especially with Camden?" I raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "What do you mean?" Wendy leaned in slightly, studying my expression. "This morning, someone at the golf club found Camden Clifford stuffed into the trunk of his own car. Badly beaten." I kept my face neutral, my stomach tightening slightly. "Really?" I asked, playing my part. She nodded, her tone serious. "Melanie told me. Apparently, she's pretty shaken up and confided some details to me. She said Camden's in the hospital." Wendy didn't mince words. She never did. "Did you have anything to do with it?" she asked directly, her sharp gaze locked on me. I kept my expression cool, leaning back in my chair. "No," I said simply. "Melanie mentioned it earlier during a work-related call. Said his wife confirmed the whole thing." For a moment, Wendy's eyes lingered on mine, searching for something. But eventually, she nodded, seeming to accept my denial. Wendy accepted my answer for now, but she warned me that things might not be so simple next time. When she asked what I meant, I just smirked. "Accidents happen in the strangest places," I said, leaving her to figure it out. That evening, I got home to find Melanie gone. Her car wasn't in the driveway, which annoyed me more than it should have. I called her, masking my irritation with a cheerful tone. "Hey, where are you?" She replied that she was visiting a friend in the hospital and assured me she'd be back soon. "Hope your friend feels better," I said, cutting the call short before she could say anything else. About half an hour later, Melanie walked through the door. She looked exhausted, like the weight of the world was on her shoulders. I kept my tone casual. "How's your friend?" She paused, clearly searching for the right words. "It was just a minor accident," she said finally. "They'll be fine soon." Her voice wavered slightly, like she was trying hard to keep herself together. Something had her rattled. Trying to appear unfazed, I offered to make us some coffee. She agreed, and as we sat sipping, I watched her closely. Slowly, she seemed to relax. But then, almost as if it slipped out, she mentioned, "One of our company reps got attacked recently." Feigning surprise, I leaned forward. "Really? What happened?" She hesitated, then explained it was Camden. He was assaulted and left in his car overnight. "But he's okay. Nothing too serious." She glanced at me quickly, then added, "The attackers must have just wanted to scare him." Nothing was stolen. I fought to keep my face neutral, my mind racing. She had no idea how much I knew. Still, Melanie caught on to my skeptical expression. Her face tightened, like she realized she'd said too much. She quickly changed the subject, but it was too late. I'd already put it all together. Moments later, she excused herself and left the room, probably to make a phone call. It was clear things were escalating. It was time to make my next move. "Hey," I called out casually. "I'm heading out for a bit. Won't be long." Without waiting for a reply, I grabbed my keys and left. This time, I drove straight to Camden Clifford's house. When I knocked on the door, a petite, dark-haired woman answered. Her eyes were tired, and she looked wary as she opened the door. "Hi," I said, introducing myself. "I'm sorry to show up like this, but my wife, Melanie, has been having an affair with your husband." Her face went pale, visibly shaken, but she stepped aside and invited me in. We sat in the living room, the air thick with tension. I laid everything out. Everything I knew about Melanie and Camden's affair. I apologized for bringing her such painful news, but told her I thought she deserved to know the truth. I also mentioned Camden's recent attack, adding that he was currently in the hospital recovering. She broke down, tears streaming as she admitted she'd suspected something for a while. She confessed that Camden had a history of affairs, but she hadn't had proof of this one until now. "I'm so tired of his lies," she said, her voice shaking with anger and sadness. "This is the last straw. I'm divorcing him, no hesitation." She wasn't looking for sympathy or advice. She'd made up her mind, and there was no turning back. She wasn't certain how long things had been going on between Melanie and Camden, but she had no doubt about Melanie's involvement. When I asked about the attack on Camden, she admitted she had no idea who could have done it. I wasn't involved, I clarified, though I didn't bother to hide the lack of sympathy in my tone. Truthfully, I wasn't sorry it had happened. We speculated for a moment. Think he crossed the wrong person? Maybe someone else's wife, I suggested. Her bitter laugh said everything. Nothing surprises me anymore, she replied flatly. She went on to explain that they'd moved back to the area in an attempt to leave behind Camden's past infidelities, hoping for a fresh start. She thought he'd changed. Clearly, she was wrong. Before I left, I handed her my locksmith and lawyer's contact information. You'll probably need these soon, I said. She nodded, clutching the paper tightly, her face a mix of exhaustion and quiet fury. On the drive home, my thoughts were laser-focused on everything still left to do. The anger inside me wasn't fiery or impulsive. It was cold, calculated, and purposeful. It fueled me, sharpening my determination to ensure my revenge was precise and complete. The reality of my marriage ending hung over me like a storm cloud, but there was no space for second thoughts. Melanie had betrayed me, and forgiveness was out of the question. The only solace I had was the certainty that the pain she'd caused me would eventually come back to her. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Melanie's car parked in its usual spot. I tapped the hood absent-mindedly, the realization hitting me hard. This might be the last time I walked through that door as her husband. Every step toward the house felt heavier, burdened by the weight of everything that had happened. When I walked inside, the air was thick with tension. The faint sound of the TV hummed softly in the background as I moved into the living room. There she was, sitting rigidly on the sofa, her posture screaming unease. Her whole body was stiff, her eyes darting anxiously. She was trying to hold it together, but I could see the cracks. She was bracing for something, though she didn't know when or how it would come. I paused in the doorway, letting the silence stretch as I stared at her. She glanced up at me, her lips parting slightly, like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. She seemed frozen, trapped in the weight of the moment. Without acknowledging her, I walked past and headed straight for the liquor cabinet. I poured myself a stiff drink, the sound of liquid splashing against glass breaking the stillness. As I turned back, taking a long, deliberate sip, I didn't break eye contact. She shifted in her seat, her unease deepening. I could see her mind working, scrambling to regain control. Finally, she sat up straighter, forcing a tone of irritation. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice just sharp enough to mask the nervous quiver underneath. I stared back at her, my face unreadable. "I'll tell you where I've been," I said, my tone cool, "if you tell me where you've been." Her eyes darted, and for a second, I thought she might crumble. But she stammered out the same lie she'd been feeding me. "I was at the hospital," she said, "with a friend." I let her words hang in the air, heavy and unchallenged. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I could see the lie settle between us, thick and undeniable. I didn't respond, just watched her squirm under my gaze. Melanie struggled to keep her story together, her words faltering as she tried to shift the conversation back to me. I wasn't having it. "No," I said sharply, cutting her off. "We're done playing this game." Her eyes widened, confusion and fear flickering across her face. "I met someone new today," I said, keeping my tone casual but loaded. "Someone who became a friend pretty quickly." I paused, savoring the way her face began to pale. Camden Clifford. The blood drained from her cheeks so fast, I almost felt bad for her. Almost. I could see the gears in her mind whirring, scrambling to figure out how much I knew. Feigning concern, she stood abruptly. "Are you okay? Do you want another drink?" I ignored her pathetic attempt at deflection and leaned forward, my voice low and cutting. "Let's not do this, Melanie. Let's talk about Camden. Let's talk about you and him." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. I didn't let her off the hook. "I know about the affair," I said flatly. "I've known for a while." Her whole body tensed, and then, Just as quickly, she started backpedaling. It was nothing, she blurted, her voice shaky. Just a fling. It didn't mean anything. I scoffed, cutting her off again. Nothing? I said bitterly. We made vows, Melanie. Did they mean nothing to you, too? She tried to apologize, her words tumbling over each other as she swore she'd make it right. It didn't mean anything. I swear. I'll fix this. I laughed. A cold, bitter sound. You're not sorry for what you did? I said, my voice dripping with contempt. You're sorry you got caught. That shut her up. For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint hum of the television. Would you have stopped? I demanded. If I hadn't found out, would you have ended it? Her silence was deafening. I leaned back, the finality of the moment settling over me like a heavy weight. You wouldn't have, I said quietly, more to myself than to her. I stood, towering over her now. Lying's become second nature to you, hasn't it? I said coldly. You're not the woman I fell in love with anymore. Those words seemed to shatter whatever confidence she had left. Her shoulders slumped, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the couch. She broke down completely, sobbing and begging. What can I do? She cried. Please, just tell me what I can do to fix this. I'll do anything. Please. I shook my head, my voice hard and unyielding. It's too late. We're done. Turning away from her, I pulled out my phone and called Wendy. I explained the situation, asking her to come over and help Melanie pack her things. When I hung up, Melanie stared at me in disbelief. Where am I supposed to go? She whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't sugarcoat it. Anywhere, I said bluntly. Go back to your lover at the hospital for all I care. When Wendy arrived, she didn't waste any time. She went straight to Melanie's bedroom, pulling out suitcases and stuffing them with clothes and personal items. I stood there silently, watching as the woman I once loved was methodically erased from my life. Despite everything, I felt a faint tug of concern, just enough to make sure she left safely. That last, frayed thread of care. As Melanie walked out the door, her shoulders slumped in defeat, Wendy led her to the car. It was over, and yet, I knew that Camden, lying in his hospital bed, would soon have to face the full weight of his actions, just like Melanie was about to face hers. Two other women, both secret lovers of Camden, started showing up at the hospital. Each was blissfully unaware of the other's existence, until one fateful afternoon when their paths finally crossed. What followed was an explosion of fury, accusations, and heartbreak. The full extent of Camden's lies and betrayal came crashing down, leaving everyone involved devastated. Meanwhile, Camden's wife, shattered by the revelation of his infidelity, stood silently by, watching as her husband's web of deceit unraveled. Camden's wife wasted no time filing for divorce, demanding full custody of their children. Humiliated and furious, she was determined to sever all ties with him completely. Camden, left to face the fallout alone, watched as the scandal quickly became public. His workplace acted swiftly, citing corporate ethics violations. They terminated him on the spot, stripping him of his primary income and any semblance of stability. Legal battles followed soon after, divorce proceedings, alimony demands, mounting court fees. Camden's savings dwindled rapidly, leaving him financially crippled. With his reputation in tatters, the promising future he'd once had lay in ruins. Even Melanie, who had once found solace in their affair, cut ties with him. She couldn't forgive his additional betrayals or the tangled web of lies he'd spun beyond her. As Camden's life spiraled into chaos, the two women who'd confronted each other at the hospital also walked away, unwilling to remain caught in his destructive orbit. Friends and family, disgusted by his actions, distanced themselves too. For the first time, Camden was left utterly alone, forced to confront the consequences of his choices. The damage he had caused to others and to himself was undeniable. Left with nothing but the wreckage of his deceit, Camden faced a life shattered beyond repair. In the weeks that followed, I often found myself reflecting on the aftermath of that stormy night. Wendy and I stayed in touch, sharing brief but supportive conversations. She seemed relieved that the truth was finally out in the open, and in her own way, she became a grounding presence for me as I adjusted to the stillness that followed Melanie's departure. But as time went on, Wendy grew distant, as if she needed space to process everything in her own way. Couldn't blame her. The chaos we'd navigated was a lot to handle. Still, knowing she understood the complexity of my situation gave me a measure of comfort. For Melanie, life took a very different turn. She came to realize that things would never return to the way they once were. Every new partner sensed something about her past, an invisible shadow she couldn't escape. No matter how much she tried to move forward, there was always that flicker of doubt in their eyes. Warm, easy conversations would quickly turn tense as suspicion crept in. Each man wondered, deep down, if she could ever truly be faithful. As time passed, Melanie found herself increasingly isolated. The dream of a happy family, once so close, slipped further and further out of reach. But that chance was gone. With each failed attempt to connect with someone new, Melanie began to understand how fragile trust really was, and how rare. It was something she had taken for granted, something she might never reclaim. Left alone, haunted by the memories of the life she had thrown away, Melanie was forced to face the bitter truth. She had destroyed the one thing that could have made her happy, and now she was left with nothing but regret. Melanie was left surrounded by regrets and what-ifs, forced to confront the happiness she had willingly sacrificed. Each passing day weighed heavily on her as she replayed the choices that had led to her isolation, grappling with the reality of what she had lost. Months later, I crossed paths with Wendy again at a mutual friend's gathering. She seemed brighter, more at ease, and seeing her in a happier place felt right. Our eyes met, and in that long, knowing look, it was as if we silently acknowledged everything unspoken between us. There was a new warmth in our connection, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Later that evening, Wendy quietly confessed her feelings for me. The honesty in her voice shifted something inside me. For the first time, I allowed myself to recognize what had always been there. Wendy had meant more to me than I'd ever admitted, even to myself. In that moment, surrounded by years of shared memories and mutual support, I realized the depth of my feelings. I loved her, deeply, genuinely. Our love story began to unfold simply and honestly, built on the foundation of everything we had been through together. Wendy and I married, cherishing the peace and trust we had finally found. Our relationship became a testament to mutual respect and loyalty, precious gifts we both knew we had to safeguard. A year and a half after our wedding, we welcomed our son, a bundle of joy who filled our lives with purpose and love. 2 years later, we were blessed with a daughter, completing our family. From sleepless nights to first steps and endless laughter, Wendy and I grew together as parents. We savored each milestone with our children, relishing the small, everyday moments that made our life whole. Through it all, Wendy and I learned that love and respect were more than just ideals. They became the bedrock of everything we built together, holding us steady through every challenge and joy. We treasured our roles as partners and parents, knowing that true happiness came from nurturing the bonds that mattered most. As our children grew, so did our commitment to one another. Together, we wove a legacy of love and trust, something enduring and strong enough to carry us through anything life brought our way. In the end, everyone got what they deserved by their actions. Melanie was left with her regrets, Camden with his ruined life. But Wendy and I found the happiness we had both been searching for, proving that the choices we make, and the love we give, define the lives we create.